The Lost Tribes from Outer Space by Mark Dem, Part 6, Chapter 15, Yahweh's Supernormal Powers. Yahweh put his people in school, but purely educational methods are inadequate for exercising total control over minds. He had other methods. We see him applying them at the beginning of the historical period. To bring the Hebrews out of Egypt, he needed an agent among them, and his first step was to persuade Moses to accept the mission. Moses doubted his chances of success. Why should the Hebrews believe him when he spoke to them in the name of Yahweh? That was the only guarantee he could give them. He would have to take 600,000 men and their dependents out of a country in which they had grown accustomed to living. They were forced to do hard labor there, but at least they had enough to eat. They were oppressed, but the Jews were already used to oppression. The Israelites complained to Moses and Aaron in the wilderness and said, "If only we had died at the Lord's hand in Egypt, where we sat round the flesh pots and had plenty of bread to eat. But you have brought us out into this wilderness to let this whole assembly starve to death." Exodus 16, 2-3. Before the greatness of his task, Moses felt his weaknesses. In the first place, he had speech difficulties. He was not an orator. "O Lord, I have never been a man of ready speech, never in my life, not even now that thou hast spoken to me. I am slow and hesitant of speech." Exodus 4:10. Yahweh tried to convince him by practicing a kind of hypnosis in which Moses would serve as a medium. "Go now, I will help your speech and tell you what to say." When Moses was still reluctant, Yahweh proposed a two-stage relay using Moses' brother Aaron. "He will do all the speaking to the people for you. He will be the mouthpiece." Yahweh acted like any other hypnotist. The Lord said, "What have you there in your hand?" "A staff," Moses answered. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it down, and it turned into a snake. Exodus 4:2-3. Then the Lord said, "Put your hand inside the fold of your cloak." He did so, and when he drew it out, the skin was diseased, white as snow. The Lord said, "Put it back again," and he did so. When he drew it out this time, it was as healthy as the rest of his body. Yahweh's abilities as an illusionist were given free rein when it proved necessary to put pressure on Pharaoh to make him let the Hebrews go. There have been many efforts to explain the plagues of Egypt by attributing plausible natural causes to them. In the case of the water of the Nile being turned into blood, the explanation is said to lie in a rare but known phenomenon that does not actually involve blood, of course, but the pollen of a certain plant scattered by the wind with a red color that justifies the metaphor. There really are rains of frogs, or something like them. Hail does not fall often in Egypt, but in some parts of the delta, there has been precipitation that can be called by that name. Science fiction fans prefer other interpretations. I will suggest a few to them. The water that turned into blood and killed fish evokes the pollution of streams by toxic substances dumped into them, and its color strikingly recalls the phenomenon of the red tide. Since there are anti-hail rockets, why not envisage devices that favor the formation of hailstones? The frogs, why not a form of bacteriological warfare in which bacteria are replaced by batrachians? Yahweh was obviously capable of using such procedures, but why have theorists of both tendencies not seen, from simply reading their Bible, that the plagues of Egypt never actually happened, that they were of the same nature as the transformation of Moses' staff into a snake? Yahweh himself speaks of signs. Their purpose was to demonstrate his talents as an illusionist. Pharaoh summoned his own magicians, and they entered into competition with Moses. They too could change their staffs into snakes. When Moses and Aaron bloodied the water of the Nile, as well as all the rivers, streams, pools, and cisterns in the country, the Egyptian magicians did the same thing by their spells. And still Pharaoh remained obstinate. Exodus 7:22. Then the Lord told Moses to say to Aaron, "Take your staff in your hand and stretch it out over the rivers, streams, and pools to bring up frogs upon the land of Egypt." This, incidentally, rules out the idea of a rain of frogs. These frogs were so numerous that they came into Pharaoh's house, in his bedroom, and on his bed, as well as the houses of his courtiers and his people, and even into their ovens and kneading troughs. This time, again, the magicians showed that they had equal ability by bringing up frogs into Egypt. If we are to believe the preceding description, it would have been hard to put more frogs in the country than there were already, which means that the two feats must not have been performed at the same time. The fifth plague was a murderous pestilence that struck the grazing herds of Egypt: horses, asses, camels, cattle, and sheep. The result is clearly stated. The fifth plague affected not only the Egyptians, but also their animals, which were supposedly dead, and the hail that followed again struck both people and animals. Poor Egypt. Besides all this, she also underwent invasions of maggots, flies, and locusts, and 3 days of darkness so thick that men could not see one another. Such a series of catastrophes would have been more than enough not only to convince Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go, but also to ruin his economy, undermine the foundations of his state, and simply put an end to the existence of Egypt. No, Yahweh did not produce real disasters through Moses and Aaron. Thinking he did means that one has read the Bible inattentively, or with an indiscriminate urge to believe in wonders. The visitor from space had a power of suggestion which Egyptian occultists also possessed, but to a lesser degree. We know little of how it operated, but it was obviously quite strong, since it bent the firmest wills and threw terror into the most hardened hearts. Such methods are now looked down upon. The advance of technology has cast discredit on practices regarded as primitive and unworthy of an enlightened civilization. This attitude may not be justified. The disciplines grouped under the name of psychic sciences are a path that is now neglected but may be capable of leading somewhere, to summits that orthodox science will never reach. Some scientists are beginning to concern themselves with those disciplines. We should not be surprised that Yahweh, a cosmic traveler, engaged in what we regard as childish practices. Instead, we should ask ourselves whether a highly advanced civilization is not one which, after developing electronics and nuclear physics, has begun exploring the subjective realm of occultism. Our technology invariably comes up against the obstacle of economics. Its possibilities are vast, but they are too expensive. The methods of rejuvenation, or even indefinite prolongation of life, that some investigators foresee in the near future, will not be within the reach of most people, and they therefore lead to an impasse because it is not psychologically desirable to produce survivors who will no longer have any reason to live in a world that has become alien to them. Space travel will not go beyond the stage of exploration, because transporting whole colonies to another planet would exhaust the resources of those who remain behind, thus depriving the exodus of any practical utility. There have been many inventions that remain unusable for strictly financial reasons, and so progress is blocked every day despite the common belief that nothing can stop it. The solution may lie in a radically different option: exploitation of the resources that man has within his soul, where engineers have not yet thought of trying to apply their ingenuity. It is not implausible that Yahweh knew how to control those resources. He acted on his people in ways which suggest that he did. He used material means as little as possible. He usually penetrated the heart directly, breathing terror or sweetness into it. He spoke to the leaders of his people through the mysterious device of the Ark of the Covenant. But the prophets soon took over, inspired by him without the use of any kind of apparatus, from soul to soul. I will stand at my post. I will take up my position on the watchtower. I will watch to learn what he will say through me. Habakkuk 2:1. In the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah 1:1. He communicated extrasensory visions to them. On the 5th day of the 4th month in the 30th year, while I was among the exiles by the river Kabar, the heavens were opened and I saw a vision of God. Ezekiel 1:1. As a general rule, Yahweh did not ask the consent of the prophets he chose to be the interpreters of his will and thought. They were seized by his spirit and made to transmit his messages. They spoke as the messages came to them, like interpreters at meetings of the United Nations. So they had no time to polish their style. What is left to us of their words is due to the prodigious memory of those who heard them, a faculty that was kept alive by peoples who preceded paper civilization. Much later, their revelations were put down in writing. Despite the alterations and additions that are inevitable when scribes go to work, the spoken style has been preserved, and we can still feel the fervent flow of speech from inspired lips. Images clash with each other, and ideas burst forth from the disorder of words with the immediacy of a first-hand report. The interpreter has no time to reflect on what he is transmitting. He speaks on and on. He is nothing but a mouth. That is why the books of the prophets are unique and deeply moving documents. They contain direct messages from the extraterrestrial who made the Jews. The style is his, the seething thoughts are his, the symbols are his language. He usually chose symbols from the familiar world of those to whom he wanted to make himself understood. But occasionally, at times of great tension, when he was angry, for example, or in a hurry, we know that he was particularly impatient. His pedagogical concerns vanished, and he borrowed archetypes from his own universe. The prophecy then became abstruse. The prophet described his vision as best he could, but it reflected landscapes and things that are alien to us. With the unspecialized vocabulary at his disposal, he labored to communicate a clear portrayal of the objects or beings he saw. This was the case with Ezekiel when he was at grips with the glory of Yahweh, having seen only carts, wagons, perhaps a few siege weapons, and elementary tools that did not go beyond the technological level of the winch. He was seized by the spirit of Yahweh and forced to describe the equivalent of a modern LEM, or most likely, something far more complex. How did Ezekiel tell what he saw? In the awkward manner of a schoolboy trying to write a composition on a subject too advanced for him. The wheels sparkled like topaz, and they were all alike. In form and working, they were like a wheel inside a wheel, and when they moved in any of the four directions, they never swerved in their course. Ezekiel 1:16-17. It would seem, though we cannot be certain of it, that the vehicle was actually not mounted on wheels. The appearance of the creatures was as if burning coals or torches were darting to and fro among them. The fire was radiant, and out of the fire came lightning. Ezekiel 1:13. Would a pygmy not express himself in this way after watching the takeoff of a jet plane? This is not the place to discuss at length what the content of the vision may have been. I have quoted Ezekiel to show the manner in which the Lord from space communicated with his people. The books of the prophets have a strangely authentic ring to them. If they were fictitious, their authors would not have gone beyond the realm of their own knowledge so often. Even when he invents a story out of whole cloth, a liar tries to make it coherent, if only so that it will be believed more easily. The language of the prophets is often incoherent. Those who preserved it down to our time must have serious reasons for resisting the urge to destroy, at least partially, such a hodgepodge, Voltaire called it. But now, after thousands of years, we have suddenly begun to see that it may not really be a hodgepodge. Our recent scientific discoveries make us surprisingly receptive to many passages written by innocent hands. The incoherence is being resolved. We do not yet understand everything, but solid points are appearing which may provide us with stepping stones for crossing that sea of apparent absurdity. Voltaire was wrong. and those who transmitted the message were right, not only patient chroniclers skilled in establishing dates and genealogies, but also the many prophets who were spontaneous, uncultured poets like Amos, who was a sheep farmer when Yahweh sent him to speak in his name. Through the voices of the humble as well as those of initiates, the providence God who came from a star intervened in the course of things. It is not without reason that the Bible says in Judges 13:19 that his works are full of wonder. Chapter 16. Yahweh's Foreign Policy. As soon as he resigned himself to letting the Anakim live and realized that his people would not substitute themselves for existing populations, but would coexist with them, Yahweh undertook political actions designed to establish his reputation all over the earth. It was a way of achieving his goal, recognizing that the God of Israel was the most powerful. The nations would pay him the homage he wanted, even if they did not worship him and remained under the sway of their idols. He would be God for them too. He would therefore exercise his powers on the Goyim also. They would enable him to dominate history. Dreams, as distinct from the visions he sent to the prophets, were an effective method that he used often. While visions were visited on the minds of Jews, dreams were usually imposed on Goyim. Yahweh thus influenced the rulers of nations foreign to his people in directions that favored his designs. This was the case with Pharaoh, who, as the result of a dream, accepted a prime minister devoted to Yahweh. It was also the case with Nebuchadnezzar, among others. Having had a dream, he called in the magicians who had always been so numerous in Chaldea and told them that they must tell him both what he had dreamed and what it meant. Otherwise, they would be put to death in an unpleasant way. You shall be torn in pieces, and your houses shall be forfeit. Daniel 2:5. Not surprisingly, the magicians declined to try. They would have been glad to comment on the king's dream if they had known it, but they were completely at a loss to describe it without the slightest initial information. They referred their master to a specialist they knew, feeling sure that he would be able to penetrate the mystery. That specialist was none other than Yahweh. What your majesty requires of us is too hard. There is no one but the gods, who dwell remote from mortal men, who can give you the answer. Daniel 2:11. In other words, it could be given neither by a man, no matter how well versed in occultism he might be, nor by the gods of the nations who lived among them on earth. Their idols, Goyim, were here testifying to the power of Yahweh. Daniel and his companions, young Jews who had been deported after the taking of Jerusalem, knew that only Yahweh could give the answer. Since he had sent the dream to the king, he obviously knew its content. They asked him to let them know the secret, and it was revealed to Daniel. Daniel went to Nebuchadnezzar and told him both the dream and its interpretation. As you watched, O king, you saw a great image. This image, huge and dazzling, towered over you, fearful to behold. The head of the image was of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet part iron and part clay. Daniel 2:31-33. It announced future events concerning Chaldea. After the reign of the powerful Nebuchadnezzar would come the Median conquest. Then power would pass to the Persians and Greeks. Alexander's successors would divide the empire, which explained the two materials of which the feet were made, one being more fragile than the other. The dream ended with the image being destroyed by a stone hewn from a mountain. In the period of those kings, the God of heaven will establish a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. That kingdom will never pass to another people. It shall shatter and make an end of all these kingdoms, while it shall itself endure forever. Daniel 2:44. I will point out in passing, since I have cited Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that the prediction came true except for the last part, the fall of the stone that was to have established Yahweh's reign. It was to have taken place after the final liquidation of Alexander's empire at about the time of Jesus. But nothing of the sort actually happened. Was Yahweh mistaken, or did he simply change his mind? Everything I have read and understood suggests that the destruction of the nations, which was planned and announced too long not to happen someday, was intended for that period. What caused the change? Perhaps it was Jesus himself. I will come back to that subject in a later chapter. For the moment, what is important to note is that once again a servant of Yahweh became the trusted agent of a foreign sovereign. Then the king promoted Daniel, bestowed on him many rich gifts, and made him regent over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel 2:48. But that was in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Nowadays, Yahweh, if he still exists, has given up that kind of action. How do we know? How many Jews have taken part in the governments of nations in modern times? How many have been, like Joseph and Daniel, advisors to statesmen? How have they done so? In exactly the same way, except for the use of dreams. And even there we cannot be certain. By distinguishing themselves as experts in solving economic or scientific problems, by becoming wise men in the eyes of those who hold power. Hitler tried to justify his frenzied anti-Semitism by invoking the political influence of Jews, which he considered nefarious. Was the purpose of his plan to counter the mysterious action of Yahweh? The extraterrestrial visitor could bring that weapon into play whenever he saw fit. Well-used knowledge generates power. From the beginning, we saw him handing out particles of his science to the Jews. Yahweh's second objective was to make himself known and feared. He clearly showed this in his conflict with Pharaoh. "You must tell your brother Aaron all I bid you say," he said to Moses, "and he will tell Pharaoh, and Pharaoh will let the Israelites go out of his country, but I will make him stubborn. Then will I show sign after sign and portent after portent in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not listen to you, so I will assert my power in Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment I will bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt in their tribal hosts. When I put forth my power against the Egyptians and bring the Israelites out from them, then Egypt will know that I am the Lord." Exodus 7:2-5. Speaking for his master, Moses said to Pharaoh, "When I leave the city, I will spread out my hands in prayer to the Lord. The thunder shall cease, and there will be no more hail, so that you may know that the earth is the Lord's." Exodus 9:29. After the eighth plague, the locusts, Pharaoh admitted defeat, although he later went back on his decision. "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you," he said. "Forgive my sin, I pray, just this once." Exodus 10:16-17. It would have been easy for Yahweh to spare himself the effort of producing the next two plagues, but he again made Pharaoh obstinate. He could have avoided 9 of them, in fact. "This time I will strike home with all my plagues against you, your courtiers and your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. By now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have vanished from the earth. I have let you live only to show you my power and spread my fame throughout the land." Exodus 9:14-16. He never missed a chance to carry on his propaganda, even at the expense of his people. When he fomented wars to punish them for their infidelities, it was also to increase his personal renown among the Gentiles. The taking of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and the massive deportation that followed can be charged against the infidelity of King Manasseh, who did what was wrong in the eyes of the Lord. 2 Kings 21:2. He built altars for all the host of heaven in the 2 courts of the house of the Lord. He made his sons pass through the fire. He practiced soothsaying and divination, and dealt with ghosts and spirits. He shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem full to the brim. This disastrous reign might have been effaced by that of Josiah, who did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, swerving neither right nor left. but it was not enough to erase the sins of Manasseh. One may wonder, however, why he did not personally punish the guilty and wash his Jews' dirty linen in private. From one end of Old Testament history to the other, he preferred to give foreign nations the chastising role that seemingly should have been his. In view of this, it is hard not to attribute political ulterior motives to him and think that in the case mentioned above, for example, the destruction of his temple by the Chaldean army and the exile of the Judean elite in Babylon were not too high a price to pay for the recognition by Cyrus that followed. Cyrus had the same temple rebuilt and publicly acknowledged Yahweh. This is the word of Cyrus, king of Persia. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he himself has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. To every man of his people now among you I say, God be with him, and let him go to Jerusalem in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God whose city is Jerusalem. Ezra 1, 2 through 3. His acknowledgement entailed a reward. Yahweh did not hesitate to give it to him by betraying his covenant. The Lord, by the eyes of me, has given all the kingdoms of the earth. This text, legalized by the Bible, has an unquestionable juridic value. Yahweh gave Israel's inalienable rights to the Persians only provisionally, of course, since Alexander's conquest would soon nullify the transfer. But it was essentially a political deal that shows his enigmatic face in a new light. The exemplary nature of punishment was always of concern to him, inside and outside of Israel. Soon I shall do something in Israel, which will ring in the ears of all who hear it. 1 Samuel 3:11. What mattered was for it to be known that Yahweh was the strongest of all, the superior being who cast his great shadow over the earth. I will give you, he said to Cyrus, treasures from dark vaults, hoarded in secret places, that you may know that I am the Lord, Israel's God, who calls you by name. For the sake of Jacob my servant and Israel my chosen, I have called you by name and given you your title, though you have not known me. I am the Lord, there is no other, there is no God beside me. I will strengthen you, though you have not known me, so that men from the rising and the setting sun may know that there is none but I. I am the Lord, there is no other. I make the light, I create darkness, author alike of prosperity and trouble. I, the Lord, do all these things. Isaiah 45, 3-7. Yahweh seemed to love his people. Whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye. Zechariah 2:8. But his solicitude was always subordinate to the fidelity shown to him. It ceased during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, when a large number of Israelites worshipped Greek idols and did not come into operation again until Judas Maccabeus organized his great resistance movement. Meanwhile, Judas, also called Maccabeus, and his companions were making their way into the villages unobserved. They summoned their kinsmen and enlisted others who had remained faithful to Judaism until they had collected about 6,000 men. 2 Maccabees 8:1 in the Apocrypha. They called on Yahweh for help, and once his band of partisans was organized, Maccabeus proved invincible to the Gentiles, for the Lord's anger had changed to mercy. It should be noted that this result was not obtained by faithfulness of heart. The episode comes after an impressive description of the martyrdoms caused by the Greeks' efforts to make the Jews worship Zeus and give up their ancestral practices. It was forbidden either to observe the Sabbath or to keep the traditional festivals, or to admit to being a Jew at all. 2 Maccabees 6:6. Eleazar, one of the leading teachers of the law, allowed himself to be flogged to death rather than eat pork. A mother and her 7 sons were tortured to death because they refused to violate the laws of their ancestors. But Yahweh did not help his people until Judas and his companions had raised a sizable force, one that would have an appreciable weight in the military balance. He then marched with them, making them win victory after victory. They defeated Nicanor, son of Patroclus, who had been selected by the governor of Kol Syria and Phoenicia to wipe out the Jews. With 20,000 soldiers behind him, he felt so sure of himself that he planned to pay the tribute that Antiochus owed to the Romans by selling the Jews he would take prisoner, and he had already made an offer to the slave merchants. Nicanor survived the defeat and ran away, and was indeed very lucky to reach Antioch after losing his whole army. So the man who had undertaken to secure tribute for the Romans by taking prisoner the inhabitants of Jerusalem showed the world that the Jews had a champion and were therefore invulnerable, because they kept the laws he had given them. 2 Maccabees 8:35-36. Yahweh continued his aid to Judas when Antiochus, having learned of Nicanor's route as he was approaching Ecbatana, said, "When I reach Jerusalem, I will make it a common graveyard for the Jews." He intervened directly by striking Antiochus with illness, then making him fall out of his chariot. The king became so gravely infected that the whole army was disgusted by the stench of his decay. Trying to win Yahweh's favor, he wrote a conciliatory letter to my worthy citizens, the Jews, but the Lord brought his life to a pitiable end in the mountains of a foreign land. In Ezekiel 36:22-23, there is a confession from the celestial protector himself. Here is what he said about the support he gave the Jews after the Babylonian exile. "It is not for your sake that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the peoples where you have gone. I will hallow my great name, which has been profaned among those nations. When they see that I reveal my holiness through you, the nations will know that I am the Lord." No, the overall picture of the missionary from space presented by the Bible is not that of a tender-hearted father. He pursued selfish ends. If he can be regarded as a God of love on the basis of certain passages, the love involved is primarily that which the Jews were to feel for him. He had no more or no less real concern for the happiness of his people than any statesman who claims to be working for the public good. The descendants of Abraham sensed this when they were reluctant to follow Moses into the wilderness. And Adam and Eve had a premonition of it when, having eaten the forbidden fruit, they discovered that they were Jews. Chapter 17. Forbidden Images. Yahweh, a candidate for divine status, had a great deal to do in order to be recognized not only by the Goyim, but also by his own people. Man's natural inclination is invariably toward idols. It is remarkable that the Jews, with access to a real God capable of effective physical intervention in their affairs, sometimes preferred motionless, powerless symbols made by their own hands. "Idols," said Jeremiah, "can no more speak than a scarecrow in a plot of cucumbers." Foreign nations, abandoned to their free will and excluded from Yahweh's solicitude, had no other choice. When they had been reached by his propaganda and knew of his existence and immense powers, they could only envy the people who had such a protector watching over them. He was not for them. He was against them, in fact, and did not hide his intention of wiping them off the face of the earth. It is understandable that they should have turned to statues of wood or stone, or at best, to the stars in the sky. Perhaps one of those bright stars would someday come down, as the one called Yahweh had done, and protect the Gentiles. But what advantage could the Jews have in forsaking the living providence who had given them countless signs of attention, the God who had made them with his own hands? The reason repeatedly given in the Bible is that they let themselves be corrupted by foreigners and seduced by images. The example of the Goyim turned them away from their duties. This was not the least important reason in Yahweh's mind when he considered ridding the earth of that rabble. When he brought Abraham and his family out of Chaldea to make his fourth selection, the Hebrews had formed the habit of keeping household idols, known as teraphim, in their homes. Yahweh gently set about eliminating that reprehensible custom. He was patient for 2 generations. As we have seen earlier, Jacob went to the land of his ancestors to take a wife and came back with two, Leah and Rachel. First, he had to work 14 years for his father-in-law, Laban, to earn the right to take the two sisters away. But then Laban acted in bad faith and tried to keep him longer. It appeared to Jacob that only by running away could he return to Canaan. Just before their departure, Rachel stole her father's teraphim. He pursued the fugitives and caught up with them in the hilly country of Gilead. He had to accept being separated from them, but he lamented over the loss of his idols. Why did you steal my gods? Genesis 31:30. Was Jacob an accomplice in his wife's theft? It is unlikely, since he confidently told Laban to search his tents. The teraphim were in Rachel's tent, hidden in a camel bag. Laban's previous conduct shows that he was a crafty man. He was quite capable of finding the hiding place and setting off a disaster, because Jacob had said, "Whoever is found in possession of your gods shall die for it." But Rachel was even craftier than her father. She sat down on the camel bag and said to him when he came into her tent, "Do not take it amiss, sir, that I cannot rise in your presence. The common lot of woman is upon me." Genesis 31:35. In view of the taboos concerning menstruation, it is not surprising that Laban left the tent empty-handed. It was not until much later, when Jacob's children were grown, that teraphim were discarded for good. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Rid yourselves of the foreign gods which you have among you." So they handed over to Jacob all the foreign gods in their possession and the rings from their ears, and he buried them under the terebinth tree near Shechem. Genesis 35:2-4. From then on, there were to be no more idols. Yahweh was the only God the Jews were allowed to worship, but the story shows most of them succumbing to temptation all through their history by worshiping the gods of other peoples. They were mercilessly punished for it each time, but they kept falling back into sinful ways. There was no greater crime. If anyone sacrificed to idols or heavenly bodies and was seen by two or more witnesses, he was to be taken to a gate of the city and stoned to death. You shall not make idols for yourselves. You shall not erect a carved image of a sacred pillar. You shall not put a figured stone on your land to prostrate yourselves upon. Leviticus 26:1. There is a long list of punishments for disobedience to the being who wrote the tables of the law. I will pile your rotting carcasses on the rotting logs that were your idols. Idols were always presented as inventions of the pagans. When the Israelites made them, it was in imitation of others that they had seen elsewhere. In this sense, we can speak of borrowings from the cultural heritage of other Mediterranean peoples. The distinctive culture of Israel was organized around the inimitable presence of Yahweh. Idols were designated by terms of strong abuse: horrors, abominations, refuse, excretions, impurities. Jehu's men pulled down the sacred pillar of the Baal and the temple itself and made a privy of it, as it is today. 2 Kings 10:27. One may wonder about the reason for Yahweh's clemency towards Solomon, who, while he was the head of state, bowed down to the idols of nearby peoples, particularly the Sidonians, Moabites, and Ammonites. The punishment did not affect him directly. It struck his sons, whose reign marked the end of the undivided kingdom. It must be taken into account that politically, Solomon's 40-year reign did much to further Yahweh's designs. The building of the temple was an important step in establishing his worship. King Solomon's reputation for wisdom made Yahweh renowned in many foreign lands and drew the powerful Queen of Sheba to him, for the servant's wisdom was reflected on his master. When the Queen of Sheba had tested Solomon's judgment, she said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and has set you on the throne of Israel." 1 Kings 10:9. It is dangerous to cast public blame on someone who embodies a cause, for it is detrimental to the cause itself. Solomon's impunity also extended to his marriage to a foreign woman. But although Yahweh's clemency spared the great king's image, it went no further. The infidelities of Solomon's successors brought immediate punishment. Jeroboam lost his young son Abijah. The moment you set foot in the city, the child will die. 1 Kings 14:12. In the reign of Rehoboam, who ascended the throne of Judah, the king of Egypt pillaged Jerusalem and its temple. Kings succeeded one another and committed acts of impiety, except for a few who restored worship to its purity and banished sinful practices as much as they could. Asa, Rehoboam's grandson, expelled from the land the male prostitutes attached to the shrines and did away with all the idols which his predecessors had made. He even deprived his own grandmother Makkah of her rank as queen mother because she had an obscene object made for the worship of Asherah. 1 Kings 15:12-13. This object was apparently a phallic symbol. Asa burned it. It would be tiresome to list all the kings who followed one another for hundreds of years and all the foreign gods who were alternately raised up and cast down. Successive conquests brought many abominations that were installed in holy places. Alien rites were imposed. Zeus was worshipped in the temple itself. Impious men held the reins of power. Those disastrous events angered Yahweh less than deliberate betrayal by his people. They were part of the vicissitudes of war, and Yahweh was a warrior God. It is not surprising that the Israelites, a stubborn people, sometimes rebelled against their obligation to worship Yahweh and no one else. They had not chosen him. It was he who had chosen them. It seems only natural that he should refuse to share their worship with other gods. But in his conflict with them on this point, there is one strange element which recurs so persistently in the Bible that it calls for closer examination. There were two kinds of idols, those carved from wood, stone, silver, or gold, and those made of cast metal. The latter were not called idols, but images, and they were always referred to separately. And the 5 men who had gone to explore the country went indoors to take the idol and the image, ephod and teraphim. Judges 18:17. A curse upon the man who carves an idol or casts an image. Deuteronomy 28:15. Those who trust in an image, those who take idols for their gods, turn tail in bitter shame. Isaiah 42:17. When the word image is not used, the word God replaces it. Do not resort to idols. You shall not make gods of cast metal for yourselves. Leviticus 19:4. You shall not make yourselves gods of cast metal. Exodus 34:17. At first sight, it seems strange that the method of manufacture should have any importance in an area where only intentions should be judged. Worship of anything made by man deprived the Lord of some of the reverence he felt entitled to demand for himself alone. It could be regarded as a withdrawal, a declaration of spiritual independence, a refusal of allegiance, or any number of other things. But the attitude was the same whether the idol was made of clay, wood, feathers, or bone. What was the origin of that selective prohibition? The question of cast metal arose for the first time in the wilderness of Sinai, while Yahweh was transmitting his laws to Moses. This was the famous episode of the golden calf made by Aaron at the request of the Hebrews, who were worried by their leader's long absence. There is actually no mention of a golden calf, but of an image of a bull calf. Exodus 32:8. It so happened that the Hebrews' gold earrings were their only source of metal that could easily be melted, and they enthusiastically gave them to Aaron. But the narrator pays no particular attention to the fact that gold was the metal used. While this was taking place, Yahweh was giving Moses the laws that included the prohibition against images. The enigmatic nature of that prohibition has never been satisfactorily explained. Let us examine it a little more closely. Yahweh said, "You shall not make a carved image for yourself, nor the likeness of anything in the heavens above." Exodus 24. This was immediately after he had said, "You shall have no other God to set against me." And he then extended the prohibition to likenesses of anything on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. Moses later said to the Israelites, "On the day when the Lord spoke to you out of the fire on Horeb, you saw no figure of any kind. So take good care not to fall into the degrading practice of making figures carved in relief in the form of a man or a woman, or of any animal on earth or bird that flies in the air, or of any reptile on the ground, or fish in the waters under the earth." Deuteronomy 4:15-18. Although the prohibition applies to mammals, birds, reptiles, and fish, it applies first of all to God, Yahweh, the visitor from space. Let us return to the golden calf. Why did the people ask Aaron to make it? Because Moses had not come back. He had gone up the mountain where Yahweh had come down, and nothing more had been heard from him. Had Yahweh taken him away, leaving the fugitives from Egypt alone in the wilderness? They were seized with panic. In leaving Pharaoh's land, they had headed into the unknown. Formidable enemies were waiting for them to the east. They had felt protected while the spacecraft was moving in front of them, but now they were exposed and helpless. 600,000 men on foot, with their children and dependents, untrained in warfare, and probably without an adequate number of weapons. So they said to Aaron, "Come, make us gods to go ahead of us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up from Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Exodus 32:1. Why should a golden calf have been the right object for quieting the people's apprehension and making them better able to confront an enemy? Why should the problem have been to make the idols they lacked, something which, after all, could have waited? The Israelites quickly gathered their gold earrings, and the metal was cast in a hastily contrived mold. Why? Because they were afraid. What they wanted was to replace the protecting spacecraft that had moved in front of them. That spacecraft had a metallic appearance and a shape that was hard to specify, as Ezekiel's vision has shown us. Sometimes it looked like a disc, and at other times it may have looked like a cylinder. Without passing judgment on the phenomenon of flying saucers, I will point out that those who claim to have seen one have the same difficulty in describing exactly what they have seen. Its material is unknown to the observer, its shape changes with the angle from which it is viewed, and its brilliance also varies. The best that can be done is to compare it to a familiar object that it resembles. Our contemporaries have chosen the saucer or the cigar. Moses' contemporaries chose the calf. As for the gold they gave to make a replica, it turned out to be the material that best conveyed the luminosity of the spacecraft seen at night. As I have already said, the first people who saw the extraterrestrials land on Earth must have taken the spacecraft itself for God. Yahweh could not have been unaware of this. When he prohibited making other gods like him, he must have meant, "You shall not try to make a craft like mine." His anger flared up when he saw that the Jews had tried to reproduce his craft. His first impulse was to do nothing less than exterminate them, for if man achieved space travel, it would mean the end of Yahweh's superiority and his dream of divinity. He would have rivals who would sooner or later become as powerful as he. This was the idea that had always haunted him, rivals and perhaps adversaries. He had already shown his fear of it when Adam became capable of leaving his planet. Yahweh said, "The man has become like one of us." He immediately separated him from the source of knowledge by expelling him from Eden. It is certain that Aaron's golden calf bore only a remote resemblance to a spacecraft and was only a caricature of the weapon capable of protecting the Hebrews from the Hittites, Perizzites, and Amorites. But for Yahweh, 1,000 years are as yesterday. His anger at Sinai was directed not so much against those 600,000 frightened, vulnerable men who were more a crowd than an army, more a horde than a people, as against those who would descend from them and stubbornly advance toward their goal. breaking away from Earth's gravity, flying out among the stars, visiting other worlds. Let us assume that this was the meaning of the taboo against images. It could not have been understood by the Hebrews of the second millennium BC, and more importantly, it was not meant to be understood by them. To forbid something is to give the idea of it to people who might not otherwise have thought of it. If this interpretation is correct, the message was sent over the heads of the Jews at Sinai, to the human race of the future, to us. You shall not carve an image of God. To carve is to reproduce something, to make a replica of it. You shall not make a craft like mine. And the message was accompanied by a threat whose formulation clearly shows that it was intended for those in the future. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. I punish the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. But I keep faith with thousands, with those who love me and keep my commandments. Exodus 25-6. The address of the message is contained in the text, but it had to be coded to prevent it from being intercepted. Yahweh could have stored it underground in a place where only a technologically advanced civilization could find it when the right time came. He could have placed it near a uranium deposit, for example, in such a way that it would be discovered by 20th century miners when scientific development had reached a stage that was about to open a great era of space travel. Instead, he simply inserted it in the Bible, but in a camouflaged version. If he had limited his prohibition to the image of God, people would have wondered about its meaning until they eventually discovered it. By extending it to all living creatures, he threw intelligence off the track. People wondered about its meaning, but without discovering it, at least not during the long centuries when space travel seemed to be nothing but a whim of the imagination. Today we are capable of understanding it. If Yahweh, a visitor from space, meant to tell us that he was opposed to our plans for exploring and possibly colonizing other planets, it is time for that message to be given serious consideration by the Gentile nations that have participated to any extent in launching artificial satellites. The war of the worlds may be the war that Yahweh, a jealous God, will wage to prevent dissemination of technology that he intends to keep only for himself. Someday we may have to fight with rockets against the God of the Bible. A quotation given earlier contains an allusion to a significant aspect of the divine manifestation at Sinai. On the day when the Lord spoke to you, out of the fire on Horeb, you saw no figure of any kind. The description of that manifestation shows that Yahweh concealed his spacecraft from the people. I am now coming to you in a thick cloud. Exodus 19:9. The Israelites were not allowed to come near Yahweh. Everything took place behind a protective smokescreen. When they tried to reproduce the craft, they had to call on ancestral memories, which explains the clumsiness of the copy. Linked by Moses himself to the taboo against images, the precaution taken by Yahweh no longer leaves any room for doubt. It was the construction of spacecraft that he intended to forbid to his people. Furthermore, he seemed determined to turn them away from any form of technological civilization. Cast metal is the beginning of industry. It enables one to manufacture a series of objects from a single mold. Yahweh repeatedly took measures against working with metals in general. He wanted to prevent the Jews from going below the Iron Age. If you make a stone altar for me, you must not build it of hewn stones, for if you use a chisel on it, you will profane it. Exodus 20:24-25. At that time, Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Sinai. The altar was of blocks of undressed stone on which no tool of iron had been used, following the commands given to the Israelites by Moses, the servant of the Lord, as is described in the book of the Law of Moses, Joshua 8:30-31. Solomon obeyed the same precept when he built the temple in Jerusalem. In the building of the house, only blocks of undressed stone direct from the quarry were used. No hammer or axe or any iron tool, whatever was heard in the house while it was being built. 1 Kings 6:7. Circumcision was performed only with flint knives. Joshua 5:2. This had the same purpose as the restrictions described above. With regard to the inhabitants of earth, Yahweh maintained a policy of clinging to the past. He was on his guard against any step forward on the path that led to technology beyond the level of elementary handicraft. That was why he placed such emphasis on the restrictions of the Sabbath. You have 6 days to labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. That day you shall not do any work. Exodus 20:10. What had happened during the 6 days? The earth had been formed, then the firmament, stars, plants, animals, and finally man. What is the next stage that can normally be expected? The progression was first toward life, then toward intelligence. What is more highly developed than living and intelligent man? The pyramid of evolution lacks its capstone. There is a vacant place for the last stage, the one that will crown the edifice of creation. Yes, we know what comes next, though we have known it only recently. Higher in the hierarchy of beings than merely intelligent man, there is man whose intelligence will enable him to free himself from the physical constraints that keep him on the little dot in the cosmos called Earth. Man, the infinite traveler, of whom the serpent predicted, "You will be like gods." There is man who has become Yahweh's equal, and that is what Yahweh is determined to prevent. The seventh day is the time when man will acquire the ability to make long-range spacecraft. On that day, said Yahweh, you shall rest. That is, you shall make no spacecraft. Please stay tuned for part 7, coming soon. Peace, blessings, much love and enlightenment to you all. Paix, bénédiction, amour et illumination à vous tous. Shalom.